Okay, this is the final panel that I dubbed Futures of Geschlecht, in large part because I didn't know what the other papers were about, so it was inherently futural. As you all know, my name is Adam Rosenthal. I'm in the Department of International Studies, and I'm going to talk to you about family resemblances today. I begin with not one, not two, not three, but four epigraphs. I'll read you the lovely translations provided by Katie and Rodrigo. First, but what does Geschlecht mean? Sex, race, species, genus, family, stock, etc. The second, the end of the paragraph, also from Geschlecht III, the end of the paragraph defies translation more than ever. It multiplies the strikes, the words from the family of Schlagen, Geschlecht, and its generation, verschlagen, to separate, zerschlagen, to break, shatter, dismantle. This lexicosemantic family imports, in what is irreducible in its idiom, two inseparable connotations. And then for my final two epigraphs that I was too lazy to look at in English from For What Tomorrow, since you hand me the word deconstruction, so this is from Derrida's late interview with Rudinesco, is that right? Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Since you hand me the word deconstruction, one could show that deconstruction has always been of the family. Deconstruction of the family. And then from the next page, what does one call, or what's family called? Or I don't even know how to begin translating that. Family? What's called family? I wouldn't say without hesitation that the family is eternal, that it is unalterable, that it will continue to traverse history. It's that there is, or that there might be, maybe, some family. Okay, some social connection organized around procreation. Geschlecht. How many times will Derrida have pronounced this word? And how many times in doing so will he have refused its translation? A more difficult question. How many times will he have freely, and perhaps even unconsciously, absent-mindedly or inadvertently translated it? How many times will he have allowed it to pass silently into the folds of French or English under the cloak of invisibility as a secret? Secret Geschlecht of Geschlecht. Geschlecht III, as we all now know, was first written for Derrida's 1984-85 seminar given under the aegis of the ÖHÖSS during his inaugural year of teaching under the title of Philosophical Institutions. In the first seminar that he would freely direct, now under the general heading of Philosophical Nationality and Nationalism, Derrida produced what we now know as Geschlecht III in what I believe are the 8th through 13th sessions. Is that right? Yeah, let's say it is.
It is.
And, as he explains in that seminar's inaugural session, printed in the Oxford Literary Review as Ontotheology of National Humanism, Prolegomena to a Hypothesis, the central concern around which philosophical nationality and nationalism would hinge was to be the, quote, so this is, I'm reading from this quote. Okay, his principal concern was to be, around which philosophical nationality and nationalism, the seminar, would hinge, was to be the, quote, aporias of the philosophical translation of philosophical idioms. That is, the role, or what he calls the scandal, and even the chance, at the end of that quote, the scandal and even the chance of the idiom, which is to say, the proper or the private within philosophy. The aporia here, as always, is two-part. On the one hand, philosophy cannot but experience the irreducibility of the idiomatic, for example, the evident untranslatability of certain of its terms, or the privilege allotted to certain philosophical languages over and above others. Philosophy cannot but face the necessity of something that resists translation. It cannot resist remarking the resistance of the untranslatable. On the other hand, on the opposite side, one might wish, and much philosophical work, especially in the analytic traditions, has wished to do so, one might wish to eliminate the idiom to create a language of pure accessibility, a purely exoteric language for philosophy, without idiomaticity. And then at the conclusion of this session, which is the second quote here, at the conclusion to the first session of this seminar, from which Geschlecht III comes, Derrida thus stakes out his own interest in this problem. Quote, is there a thought of the idiom that escapes this alternative? That is one of our questions. It does not belong to the past, but is a question of the future. And here I am not just talking about the future of this seminar. The questions of nationality and nationalism are thus just as much ones of translation, of the transposability or translatability of the foreign, the foreigner, the stranger, the guest, within its other, the same, the host. Although one could not simply analogize or translate the one problem with the other, there will have been for Derrida a certain convertibility of questions of translation as they concern the inside, outside, or the inside and outside of a given language, and questions of the at-home and the strange, as they concern the problem of nations and nationalisms. Quote, no. Quote, maybe this is the, I don't know. The aporias of the philosophical translation of philosophical idioms, oh no, this is right. The aporias of the philosophical translation of philosophical idioms thus concerns at the same time national and linguistic idioms, a situation that Derrida reminds us of time and again within Geschlecht III. For example, and this is the next slide, for example on page 54 in note 2, I have here the French, followed by two versions of the translation, which the intermediary translation, followed by the what is currently the final translation. Okay, non pas de la philosophie, mais du penser avec la poésie, avec l'acte, mauvais mot, poétique. Traduction impossible, l'épreuve de ce séminaire. Okay, which was our translators wonderfully give us as not a philosophy but a thinking with poetry, with a poetic act, wrong word. Impossible translation, the challenge of this seminar. And later, in the subsequent version here, not a philosophy but a thinking with poetry, with a poetic act, wrong word. Impossible translation, the ordeal of the seminar. Now, I point this out not to poke fun at Katie and Rodrigo's massive efforts here, but rather that at stake here in the difficulty of the translation of the seminar, of course, is what is evidently possibly at stake in the seminar. So, impossible translation, the challenge, trial, ordeal, but also the experience of this seminar. A characterization that is itself perhaps untranslatable, as the question marks following challenge in our preliminary translation of the text point to. Impossible translation, the task of this seminar that we may have already failed translating. And this is actually a very Heideggerian gesture, this colon that is going to be the linchpin between two sides, but I can't get into that. Okay, so impossible translation, the task of this seminar that we may have already failed translating. That's my gloss. What if the failure of translation, its impossibility, is, properly speaking, itself impossible to translate? We would have failed even to understand the stakes of the impossibility we are here dealing with, which would be, properly speaking, the experience of this impossibility, rather than simply a translation of it. Another aporia, therefore. Impossible translation fails when it is translated, but if experienced as such a failure, it may perhaps remain faithful to itself, though only insofar as it has not succeeded in translating itself. All of this prefacing brings me back to Geschlecht, this time to the word Geschlecht, as it appears and reappears in the seminar of that name. The interest of Geschlecht for Derrida, the interest of a certain practice of deconstruction for Geschlecht, will have been just as much about the difficulty it poses to translation, the situation of its idiom, and developing, inscribing, performing a certain transposition of this idiom in a manner that perhaps refuses both sides of the traditional aporia, untranslatable, translatable. So again, I glossed this. Impossible translation, the challenge of this seminar. Names, and also this is from the version séminaire, so this is also barely made it into the text. But anyway, I'm going to make a big deal out of it, as you can see. So impossible translation, the challenge of the seminar names and perhaps even performs another form of negotiation that would be a matter of the future and not just the future of this seminar. I'm now going to make what I think is a rather uncontroversial observation. Every time that Derrida pronounces Geschlecht, Every time that he repeats and reproduces the contours of this word, he is facing us not only with the experience of its untranslatability, but no less significantly with its Geschlecht. One cannot write Geschlecht in English or French, for example, without forcing one to confront the Geschlecht of Geschlecht. That is, its race, sex, origin, and family. The race, sex, origin, and family of this term. Every time one is confronted by the foreignness of this term, by not translating it, by refusing to translate it, what one is confronted by, what one experiences, is the Geschlecht of Geschlecht, its natality, inheritance, and kin, thus its idiomaticity. The failure to translate Geschlecht, I'm not saying you guys failed by not translating the title, but structural failure to translate Geschlecht, the encounter with the impossibility of its translatability, is therefore also the experience of Geschlecht. The specificity of this term's origin, family, and inheritance, even if I don't ever comprehend it, even if I could never quite translate this experience into a verbalizable or linguistically translatable cognition. Now, the reason why I'm even able to observe this, the reason why you haven't thrown, none of you have notebooks because you're all using iPads and such, but the reason why you haven't thrown your notebooks or iPads aside and stormed out of this room is that we are all relatively comfortable with, accustomed to, and generally unfazed by the transposition, translation, or conversion of biologico-national idiomaticity with linguistic idiomaticity. Words, I would be tempted to say, like flowers, and perhaps even like human animals, originate. Or perhaps we should say that words, like flowers and like human animals, are born, have families, reproduce, and become the subject of various border controls. This translation from the biological to the linguistic, or from the linguistic to the biological, is not a simple one, of course. It is not a perfect translation, and were we to pursue the analogy very far, we would see how problematic it becomes. Yet this friction, which can quickly become scandalous, is also a chance. It is one, moreover, that, a simple word search suffices to show, Derrida was also attempting to negotiate. One that he was also perhaps wary of. Save for one instance in Geschlecht III, Derrida places all references to the lexicosemantic family of Geschlecht, the word now, in scare quotes. That is, he places the word family in scare quotes whenever he refers to the lexicosemantic family, save for one instance. Words, like people, human animals, I don't know, whatever, have families, apparently. Geschlecht, which means, among so many other things, family, Heidegger tells us this himself, making recourse to a term of Latin origin in the process, Geschlecht, which may mean family, also has a family, can be traced to a broader lexicosemantic family of words, which the retaining of the word Geschlecht is, above all, helpful for remembering. One risk of the over-hasty translation of this term is the loss of the family resemblance that it bears within the German language. Its parentage, its brother and sister terms, and also, of course, its next of kin. When one translates Geschlecht, what one loses is its Geschlecht, which is to say also its family, birthmark, parentage, descent, and filiation. The future of Geschlecht, we might say, depends on the impossibility of its translation, that it which is to say that it neither be wholly translatable nor wholly untranslatable, a modality that could encourage us to consider again what Derrida has said concerning survival in biodegradables. But I can't go there. So, what is a family? By which I do not mean what counts today as a family, be it lexical, legal, or biological. In posing the question of the family, I'd like to ask in what the aporia of the family consists, which is to say the experience of the unpassable limit of family, the bond, tie, or bind that compels the question of some family to raise itself. Where can we find the experience of the family as one of its impossible translation, by which I now mean the moment in which the family forces the question of its own translatability upon us, forces us to ask who or what might enter or exit the given family unit, where and when a passage or non-passage might be extended within and without its borders. As Derrida contends in For What Tomorrow, the two epigraphs I showed you at the beginning, it is less a question of the family than of some family, always to come, we might say, whose transhistoricity depends on what he at first calls procreation, then birth, naissance, and also at times enfantement, which is rather difficult to render in English. I guess we could say childing, but that really doesn't work at all. So So long as there is some event of birth, according to Derrida in For What Tomorrow, so long as there is some event of birth, Derrida says, there will be some family. But how we might counter, are we to know when there is such an event, when such an event of birth has taken place, and above all, when we are talking about non-human figures, such as words and things. So, Geschlecht. The Geschlecht of the word Geschlecht forces us to confront the question of birth, its birth, as we say, but also of family, no longer, however, as a fixed border or limit, but as the apparatic impermeability of some organization. So Geschlecht and family are tied together, I guess, according to me. Now, at the risk of reintroducing an all too familiar text, I'd like to conclude with a short discussion of a short text that also brings us face to face with an experience of impossible translation and impossible families. Kafka's much-loved Cares of a Family Man, Die Sorge des Hausvaters. In bringing up Kafka's troubling little tale, I do not intend to bore you with yet another effort to identify Odradek's parentage, be it that of the spool of thread that goes by that name, or the word Odradek, which the story's narrator, the Hausvater, or Père de Famille, as it is often rendered in French, which the story's narrator, the Hausvater, okay, as it is, which the story's narrator at the beginning of the story reflects on in the opening line. So here we have, and I quote, "Some say the word Odradek is of Slavonic origin and try to account for it on that basis. Others, again, believe it to be of German origin, only influenced by Slavonic. The uncertainty of both interpretations allows one to assume with justice that neither is accurate, especially as neither of them provides an intelligent meaning of the word." No. Most everyone, from Adorno and Agamben to Judith Butler, has been overly concerned with the living enigma, the open secret that is Odradek, word and thing, to the point that one commonly refers to the text itself by way of this name, forgetting the father in this way, forgetting to care for that father that cares for the father and his cares. Guess what I care about? What interests me in Kafka's pathetic tale, for it is a story of pathos, the pathos of parenting, though of another order than that either of the Metamorphosis or the Judgment, what interests me is the question of the family and the family man, Père de Famille, even if, truthfully, such a concern is a little misplaced, as the word family, familia, never actually appears in the story, nor, and I know this will come as a disappointment, nor does the word Geschlecht appear there. Yet while Familia never appears, the cares of a family man, die Sorge des Hausvaters, as the cares of the family man, as the Muirs have it, is not such a bad translation for the German die Sorge des Hausvaters, given that family itself comes from the Latin familia, meaning the slaves in a household, or household servants, those domestics who resided alongside what today we would call in English, French, or German, the family, under the same roof, or at least in the same house. Family, familia, refers neither to any biological blood relation, nor even to a juridical bond of kin, but first to the power dynamic of servitude, and then, by association, to the space, the ort, the locale or territory in which a whole bunch of people gather together. Anyway, insofar as the Latin lexical family of family involves some reference to the house, even if an indirect one, by way first and foremost of the house servant, or domestic, it offers a nice, even if unexpected, translation of the German Hausvater, or father of the house, Hausfather, who is at once master and servant, master of the house, and as such, servant to those over which he presides, beholden to his obligation to maintain and oversee them. The cares, or Sorge, of the Hausfather are both for that house and from that house, for himself, for the extension of himself that he finds in the house and its constituents. Mea culpa, and also being that I am a father, or at least that I recognize myself and appear to be recognized by another as a father, which would be the Derrida's definition of the term. Being fatherly in this way, it will perhaps come as no surprise that these are my cares too, my cares for this family man's cares, which are his and my own, we two perhaps forming some kind of alternative family unit, a Geschlecht of our own, shared by fathers of households without biological or genetico-historical bond, but only a shared care. which of course is repeating everything that Fichte already told us about said Geschlechter. Anyway, the cares of this father, as becomes clear in the story, which we'll look at in just a moment, the cares of this father, as becomes clear in the story, are both cares for the household and cares for himself, in the wake of this household's future that he cannot foresee. Cares for the idiom, or the proper. Idiom itself originally could refer to private property in Greek. Hence, cares for the idiom or the proper of his house. For, while Odradek hurts no one, schadet ja offenbar niemandem, okay, is the final part of that quote, while Odradek apparently or evidently hurts no one, for who knows what he does in secret, who knows what this secret that is Odradek has, nevertheless, aber die Vorstellung, dass mich auch noch überleben sollte, ist mir eine fast schmerzlicher. He does no harm to anyone that one can see, but the very idea that he is likely to survive me, I find almost painful. The thought or idea that Odradek should survive me, that he should remain when I am gone, is a virtually, nearly, all but painful one. Odradek apparently hurts no one, but the very idea of his survival is itself almost evidence of the possibility of the harm he might inflict, even if unintentionally. And this is pain for me, the father of the house father, knowing that Odradek might survive me, survive my house therefore, survive this household and its contents that I take to be my own extensions of my being. So, hopefully bringing it to a close. So what is the threat of Odradek that we see? These are the final lines of Kafka's story. What is this threat of Odradek? What is the worry proper to Odradek such that Odradek might solicit in the first place concerns such as this father? But we could ask whether this is not also all fathers, all recognized and recognizing fathers. Concerns such as this father now expresses. The worry of Odradek is precisely that he exists on the border, always on the move, in the threshold, both between this house and all other houses, and within the house, at the internal border or point of division that lies inside the inside of the house, for he manages to find all its internal frontiers and borders, which commonly serve to separate and partition one chamber from the next, perhaps even the servants' quarters from those of the family. Thus, the frontier of the family, both inside and outside the family, which is to say the frontier of Geschlecht. Odradek, when he is to be found spread across so many thresholds, and this is a problem for the father because the final frontier, if you will, that he forces the father to confront is not only that of Odradek's proper Geschlecht, as a word, as we saw at the beginning, right, the origin of the word, the proper Geschlecht of Odradek as a word, as a life form, as an unidentified thing, but of the family's Geschlecht, as it might intersect or cross paths with Odradek's own. That is, if he has one of his own, if he has an idiom proper to him. The way that Odradek does this, the way that Odradek brings into crisis the Geschlecht of the family, is by bearing a certain relation to kind. That is, to the child. To any child, to bring us back to Derrida, some event of enfantement, procreation, naissance, of birth, in the past or yet to come, and as a consequence to the bonds of kin, kind, family, and Geschlecht. One could not say that Odradek simply is a child. That would be too easy. But rather, one must admit, the father must admit, that when one is confronted by him, that when one is prompted to attempt the trial of addressing him, that one is thereby prompted, one is, quote, seduced, entrapped, or ensnared, verführt, okay, to treat him as a child, and thus necessarily, possibly, as one's own child. And you see my interlinear translation here. I'll read you the English. He lurks by turns in the garret, the lobbies, the entrance hall. And the German word, I'm probably making too much of this, but whatever. The German word for attic here, Dachboden, is literally roof floor. So we're even in the attic, we're still stuck between, I think. Often for months on end, he is not to be seen. Then he is presumably moved into other houses, but he always comes faithfully back to our house again. Many a time when you go out of the door and he happens to be leaning directly beneath you against the banisters, you feel inclined to speak to him. Of course, you put no difficult questions to him. You treat him, he is so diminutive that you cannot help it, rather like a child. Natürlich stellt man an ihn keine schwierigen Fragen, sondern behaltet ihn schon eine Witzigkeit verführt dazu, wie ein Kind. Well, what's your name, you ask him. Odrek, he says. And where do you live? No fixed abode, he says, and laughs. But it is only the kind of laughter that has no lungs behind it. It sounds rather like the rustling of fallen leaves. And that is usually the end of the conversation. Even these answers are not always forthcoming. Often he stays mute for a long time, as wooden as his appearance. When one confronts him, and I don't know why I'm calling, I feel very troubled that I, insidiously put this him and he into the text, but I did it, and it's too late to go back.
It's a male pronoun.
Yes, I suppose. Fine. Nevertheless, I'm a little bit troubled by the he. Anyway, when one confronts him, when one faces him, when one faces his absence of a face, his diminutiveness surely seduces, ensnares, misleads one. To treat him wie ein Kind, like a child, but also, of course, like a kind, like a kin, like one who, etymologically speaking, that is, speaking in terms of the word's birth, like one who, like a word or child, has been given birth to. For a kind, or kind, like the Greek genos, or Latin genus, refers back to an Indo-European root, meaning give birth to. Odredek's diminutive nature tricks one into treating him as a birth thing, which is to say, possibly a child, the birth point or origin of some, if not the, family, as Derrida puts it in For What Tomorrow. Odredek, now the word, and thing, confronts the father with the limit experience of all families, the being like a child which can never simply be separated absolutely from the kind of kind, because it might, too, be a kind of kin. Which might be a bit much, but it's too late. So this is the end of the text that I've already cited to you, but I put it again. So, this experience of Odredek I would call the phantasm of the family. One whose experience goes no shorter than the limit between life and death, and of mortality and immortality. This would also be an experience of impossible translation, be it into our lexical families, or into our biojuridical ones, to exactly the extent that one would not be able to say either that Odredek remains wholly untranslatable into the family, or fully translatable, able to be adopted with certainty into the fold, into the Geschlecht of Geschlecht. Will one ever be able to locate a birth certificate, definitive evidence of an event of birth for Odredek? His event, if event it is to be found in his raising of this question without resolution. Thanks.
Okay, hi, I'm Brian. I'm a philosophy guy. I did a PhD at Stony Brook in philosophy, and my kind of main focus is, I guess, place and language. So I'm kind of coming at this through that prism. The title here, TBD officially, but now I'm saying it's Place of the Poem, Language, Place, and Time in Geschlecht III, which is an awful title, but so be it. In a certain criticism of Heidegger, Levinas adopts a slightly mocking stance toward the Heideggerian themes of place, rootedness, world, and belonging. To rediscover the world means to rediscover a childhood mysteriously snuggled up inside the place, to open up to the light of great landscapes and the delight of camping in the mountains. It means to follow a path that winds its way through fields, the presence of the tree, the chiaroscuro of the forests. You get the picture. Heidegger is always critical of universalizing philosophies, of the secure distance of representational thought, a thinking that floats above our existence in the world. But might we ask if, as Levinas suggests, he takes his own refuge in certain narratives of place? If so, he might be charged with committing an ontological closure, a denial of the openness of being that is the always necessary condition for authentic dwelling. To ask this question, especially in regards to Heidegger's essay on Charcoal and his later thought in general, is to concern ourselves with what language does and immediately calls to mind his famous claim, "Language is the house of being. In its home, human beings dwell." Is this already the snug place? Is it that being is simply linguistic, that linguistic structures determine thought, or that language alone can reveal being? Interpreters of Heidegger occasionally suggest as much, but Heidegger evades such a reduction. For it's rather the case that being is brought to language, and in this way comes to human beings in their projective existence. That is, the character of the human being, as he says in the letter on humanism, is of an ecstatic inherence in the truth of being. And the clearing of being is where humans dwell, because language is the clearing, concealing advent of being itself. The relation between language and what it reveals is not like the crossing of a gap between representation and represented, or sign and referent. To conceive it in this way would be to treat language as theoretical or objective. This relation is rather the very realization of existence within being. But not any speech attains this realization. Speech is not yet saying. It is not yet language that reveals being. In order to say, one must listen, be attentive to what may be revealed, and allow for language to be creatively expressed. At its limit, this becomes the task of poetry. And in fact, Heidegger says, all reflective thinking is poetic, and all poetry, in turn, is a kind of thinking. To engage in poetic saying, which is saying of world and earth, is first to engage in listening, to allow language to beckon us toward a thing's nature. To listen keenly is to allow language to speak, and this is to speak as a poet, which is to say this is for language to carry us beyond our conventional habits. At one point, he writes, "The more poetic a poet is, the freer his saying, that is, the more open and ready it is for the unforeseen. The greater is the purity with which he submits what he says to an ever more painstaking listening. And the further what he says is from the mere propositional statement that is dealt with solely in regard to its correctness or incorrectness. Such an unconcealing may be discomfiting or leave us at a loss. As Paul Vandevelde puts it, it may leave us stunned, speechless, not knowing what to say or to think. It decenters us. And just as place for Heidegger orients us according to its own configuration, language may speak in its own way, summoning us into an encounter with being. In listening to language, then, we open ourselves to the event of becoming. In this way, Heidegger says, we allow things, plant, animal, rock, and sea and sky, to become beings without falling into objectness. Language often hardens into sedimented habit in the mode of conventional thought, precipitating an object world. But when it draws us into the event of becoming, when it astonishes us, this is when it becomes poetic. So it is that we find Heidegger reading charcoal, discerning in the poet's works an event of becoming. But what sort of event is this? Derrida, who is certainly not going to fall into any reductive reading of Heidegger, knows that being is not in language, but is brought forth by it. It is not the case that we've already arrived there in the poet's words, then, as if the unconcealing of being were simply a matter of eloquent description. Rather, whatever of being is unconcealed, which is whatever place we find ourselves oriented toward, may be approached by way of language, and indeed language may be what allows the approach, but itself is not yet arrived at in speech. Here Derrida dwells for a bit on Heidegger's own reflections on the German word Ort, or place, which Heidegger tells us originally designates the tip of the spear. What is significant here is the concretization of the theme of gathering. All the power and force of the weapon converges here. As Derrida says, gathering don lieu à lieu, it lets place take place in its indivisible unicity. An important point, though. Things are not gathered into place for Heidegger. Rather, place gathers. It is not simply a site of dwelling, but has a potency which draws us into inhabitation. The Gedicht, the poem, is a place, but this place is not the language of the poem. It is the place, we might say, that summons the poetic saying by its gathering power. Being is not in language, as we saw, but being draws out language, as it were, to gather us into dwelling. The unicity of the place of the Gedicht, for a great poet, goes beyond any single poem. The whole of their poetic saying is directed at this place, which itself remains unsaid, as it must remain, precisely because, as the summoner of language, This place cannot be reduced to linguistic expression. The Gedicht, then, the poem, remains unspoken. So, Heidegger says, this site of the poetic statement, source of the moving giving wave, holds within it the hidden nature of what, from a metaphysical aesthetic point of view, may at first appear to be rhythm. To elucidate the poem, to think with it, is already to dwell with the silence of the poet in this place. We can make a second pass at asking, has Heidegger retreated to a secure refuge in place in such a way as to commit an ontological closure? This time, the question is not asked with respect to language, but with respect to the Gedicht, the silence of the poem beyond language, and whether the place of the Gedicht is indicated by correspondence with the poetic saying. Given Heidegger's references to what is silent and what is yet concealed, one might be tempted to imagine this place as a secret and mysterious place, which, despite or because of its being beyond language, allows a special kind of poetic dwelling. Here, Derrida's concern about such a place being accessible only in the German idiom would be most salient, for it would imply an unavoidably German character and identity for this place of the most profound sort of dwelling. To consider whether this place can be construed in ontologically closed terms, we need to be clear about what sort of place it is. First of all, it is not simply a destination or abode for dwelling. It is fundamentally liminal. See especially how the imagery of both Trakhl's poetry and Heidegger's elucidation of it is drenched in the blue light of dusk, the time between day and night. This is surely significant for Derrida, who wrote in White Mythology, his essay on metaphor, that a heliocentrism covertly radiates through the whole of the Western philosophical tradition. As he says there, when we try to determine the dominant metaphor of a group which interests us because of its capacity to gather things together, then what else should we expect but the metaphor of domination augmented by that power of dissimulation which allows it to escape domination in its turn? What else but God or the sun? This metaphor is bound up in particular with what Heidegger would regard as the dominant ontotheological strain in Western thought, from Plato's allegory of the cave to Descartes' natural light. Like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, who becomes drowsy in the noonday sun and only discovers the depth of the world in his nocturnal dreams, Heidegger waits for the gloaming to have us set out. And credit Heidegger with this much: he is one of the rare Western philosophers who admit shadows into his thought, including night, which is the shadow of the earth. All this Derrida would keenly note and surely regard as not incidental given Heidegger's criticisms of ontotheology. And the liminality of dusk does suggest not just an eschewal of a metaphysics of the same that a heliocentric metaphor might imply, but also suggests transition and openness, whereby the osmotic quality of place may be realized. The Gedicht is also primarily a place of movement. We spend much of Heidegger's essay following the stranger, Fremd, and Heidegger says the German Fremd, the Old High German Fram, really means forward to somewhere else, underway toward, onward to the encounter with what is kept in store for it. However, this is not just any movement, but a searching movement. He writes, the strange goes forth, ahead, but it does not roam aimlessly without any kind of determination. The strange element goes in its search toward the site where it may stay in its wandering. Almost unknown to itself, the strange is already following the call that calls it on the way into its own. Movement as such entails transition and change, and to that extent we are still moving toward a dwelling defined by openness and the liminal, and still resistant to an ontology of domination, an ontology of the same. But here's where the analysis reaches a crucial point. For this movement does have a destination. More than that, it has a destiny. It is in fact a double movement in two directions at once, in a manner that is, Derrida notes, consistent with an omnipresent logic in Heidegger's approach. What is more originary bears the future. The more originary, the more to come. The place of Trakhl's Gedicht is not a site, in fact, or even a domain of wandering and habitation, but a departure. Place not of departure, but as departure. In the final part of his essay, Heidegger names this place. It is the evening land, the Occident, the land of a promise. We are still in the dusk, and this is the land where the sun sets. But as the land of a promise, it also thereby becomes a place of dawn. In the same movement, the place, which we now know as a departure of the Geschlecht, takes us back to a promising origin that, Heidegger says, is older than the Platonic Christian land, and in returning to it, we are taking on its promise. The evening land thus holds the rising dawn of the one Geschlecht. The relation of language to being ultimately yields a destiny, one that is superior to the destiny of urban technological civilization. It is explicitly a spiritual destiny, and while Heidegger prefers to leave aside the possibility of reading Trockle as a Christian poet, you might wonder why he even bothers with the protestations, when he goes on to write that Trockle's poetry sings of the destiny which casts mankind in its still withheld nature, that is to say, saves mankind. So we have a land that offers a promise. In following a call, we seek out this land to dwell in it, but to dwell not by residing, but by departing in two directions at once, towards its originary nature and toward a promised destiny. If anything, surely, wanting to avoid a reductive reading, Derrida underplays the Christianness of the image, which speaks at once to a lost purity and a redemptive future, so long as we follow a silent call. But whether this is really Christian thinking in a guise or not, we've reached the decisive point. After seeking after the place of the Geschlecht, what we've ultimately uncovered is time, a promised future, a course of destiny. This is not the time of progress in any of its familiar social, political, or technological tropes, but it is nonetheless a temporal movement, specifically a unifying movement, as Derrida has it, of the Geschlecht. This movement, which occurs as a return that is also futural, forms a schema that is a condition for every nationalism. The double movement allows for not just nostalgic withdrawal, as Derrida says, but also colonial expansion, the future as adventure of culture or colonization, the dwelling cultivated and colonized starting from new routes. This is not contradictory in light of Heidegger's temporal logic, and indeed it is recognizable in the curious blend of nostalgia and destined unfolding, not just in Nazism, but in various imperialist ideologies. With this temporality of advance, Heidegger enters into a logic that is devastating for place. This is the temporocentrism that has long characterized Western thought, and for all his keen attunement to the history of thought, maybe due to such keen attunement, Heidegger situates us in his idiosyncratic way within this tradition. The effect is to subordinate place to a narrative of destiny, and thus to admit all the perils of utopianism. Utopia, of course, is coined from the Greek utopos, no place. It isn't just that utopia is unachievable as no place, but that the very orientation toward an ideal future is hostile to the particularity of place. That's because insofar as it's essentially futural, a place of destiny, it necessarily lacks the texture and depth that makes for a place of dwelling. For all his attention to dwelling and the particularity of the place of the Geschlecht, Heidegger's vision is ultimately a utopian one. None of this would be troubling if the Geschlecht did not offer a call to destiny. We could accept that language is summoned by what is silent, beyond language, and yet cannot be heard without language, and that in this summoning is the linkage between language and place. We could even allow that the particularity of the German idiom is necessary to hear the particular call to which Trockle is attuned. Such may be the nature of any particular poetic hearing. But because the place of the call is the Occident and the destiny is that of humankind, we exceed this particularity in a universalism that nonetheless seeks to ground itself in a particular landscape. Even in this purported rootedness, the Geschlecht breaks free to become not a place, but a movement of time. I'm reminded of the Native American philosopher Vine Deloria's account of the difference between Native and European thought. It is the difference between thinking in terms of space and thinking in terms of time. And by space, he really means place, I think, in these terms. Deloria writes, Western European peoples have never learned to consider the nature of the world discerned from a spatial point of view. The very essence of Western European identity involves the assumption that time proceeds in a linear fashion. Further, it assumes that at a particular point in the unraveling of this sequence, the peoples of Western Europe became guardians of the world. The same ideology that sparked the Crusades, the age of exploration, the age of imperialism, and the recent crusade against communism all involve the affirmation That time is peculiarly related to the destiny of the people of Western Europe and the United States. Western religion, meanwhile, has resolved the incredibility of its narratives by secularizing itself. Instead of working toward the kingdom of God on earth, history becomes the story of a particular race fulfilling its manifest destiny. The remarkable paradox in Heidegger's thought is that this destiny is carried forward through place itself, through the particularity of landscape. This landscape is closed finally, not because it is the snug place that Levinas jabbed at, but because the narrative Heidegger draws out of it obliterates place. Would it have been possible for him simply to dwell there poetically without the obliterating temporal leap? Could we try to do so? I confess what is most difficult for me to translate is not so much Heidegger's language as his landscape, its ancient forests and streams and whatnot. Westerner I may be, but I am not feeling his forest sagas. I am from the desert, another West, from the borderlands, in fact, where just the other day thousands rallied in the name of a liminal community to oppose those who would sunder it with a wall. That is the landscape I know. What would it mean for each of us to return to our own landscapes, not in search of a destiny, but in listening to the silent calls that might summon our own languages and our own modes of placial dwelling? What if we heard in them a power that is immanent in places, not a projection beyond them? Could this be a hidden promise of the American landscape, more originary than the manifest destiny that has been imposed upon it? How's that for nationalism?
Sorry, everybody. Do I have what? I do the bath. Okay. Okay.
To step and walk a little bit to wake up.
Oh yeah, no, why? What are you so
Yeah, is it in the Meno that we get the swarm of virtues, the swarm of definitions of
Maybe.
virtue? I think it's in the Meno. A swarm of a definition.
To keep the secret, be good. I like it. To keep the secret.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Okay, so my name is David Mullins. I'm a doctoral candidate at Brown in comparative literature. And the talk I'll be giving is called A Swarm of Being, Heidegger's Metonymy. And I'd like to start with a quotation from Plato that I won't analyze, but that I think probably you'll be able to see the resonance of. So Socrates says in the Phaedrus, "The men of old were simple-minded, unlike you young philosophers. They deemed that if they heard the truth even from an oak tree or a rock, it was enough for them, whereas you seem to consider not just whether a thing is or is not true, but also who the speaker is and from what country the tale comes." So, I wanted to talk primarily about metonymy and Heidegger's use of metonymy in his reading, and this, even though initially after reading Geschlecht III, I didn't understand the importance or novelty of the text, and I had an argument actually with Rodrigo on Facebook about it, and he was nice enough to convince me, and successfully to convince me, to reinterrogate that initial impression about Geschlecht III. And I think the main thing that I found was novel, or relatively novel compared to like of spirit, was this question of metonymy and Derrida's attempt to clarify the structure of it and analyze a few specific examples of it to see how it works, right? It's not quite an affirmation of Heidegger still, right? So I agree that it's still mostly gotcha stuff in Geschlecht III. But I think that, and this is the sort of deconstructive thought guiding my whole trawl through the Trackle essay that I'm about to give you, is that by following this metonymy thread, we can find out what is the singularity or affirmative character of the Heidegger Trackle constellation. What about Heidegger's reading of Trackle is affirmative and necessary? What sort of good old Heidegger Trackle is there here? And so initially I had said, I'm not going to have any gotcha moments, but I couldn't resist, as you'll see. It's very hard to resist that when reading Heidegger, particularly this essay. But the reason why you want to find something affirmative is the same reason, or related to the reason, that in a couple of talks, people have quoted this Derrida argument in Geschlecht III about the essential being accidented from the beginning, if any accident can happen, right? Just the possibility already has to be there from the beginning. In the same way, if Heidegger could read Trackle this way, right, it can't just be a stupid accident, right? It can't just be a metaphysical problem. It has to have some necessity, even if we don't want to sign on to everything, and I certainly don't, that Heidegger does with it. So I chose, and we have these nice blue tables. I made sure they were blue. These two quotations of Derrida talking about metonymy from Geschlecht III. I'm only going to read one of them, because they're both rather long. But you can also see at the top, this is from Of Spirit. Derrida talking about Heidegger, and it says that he's discussing one of the movements of the argument, and he's saying one of these metonymies that makes all the, or enables all the miracles of this course, right? So metonymies, I think, they're the big deal with Heidegger's reading of Trackle, really. It can't work without them. And so this second quotation, how is this leap to another poem to find the answer to a question one thinks one hears in the first poem justified? Heidegger practices what I will call, not without hesitation, a metonymic transition. I hesitate to use these words because Heidegger would most likely see in them recourse to a rhetorical knowledge, confident in its technique and its categories in this place where rhetoric itself must be interrogated as a derivative moment of metaphysics. But I'm keeping these words as a guide, let's say a metonymic guide. And if you look at the French, the last sentence, I want to just highlight this, à titre indicatif, disons métonymie. So this relation of indication and metonymy is going to be important, so I just mark it there now. So with that description in mind, I want to move to one specific metonymy. So between, in the Heidegger Trackle essay, between two poems, one jump that Heidegger makes. And that starts with this Rest in Silence poem. So, I have the trackle and then how Heidegger cites him. So if you look at, and I'll just go from the English, if you look at what the trackle poem says here, you can see, first of all, Heidegger's reversed the order of things. So if you look at the holiness or sanctity of the blue flowers, he's moved them around. He's put the blue flowers in an active transitive position with the verb touches, right? This is a justifiable reading of the German. There are some translations of the German that certainly say this. There are a lot of translations, though, that just kind of leave the sanctity floating, like this one. Just the sanctity of blue flowers after. Heidegger also cuts out completely the black flight of birds, right? Which incontestably touches the beholder, right? And the touching of the beholder, that's the big deal for Heidegger here. So he cuts out the animal, switches things around so you have an active thing, right? So you might say, well, it's cheating. I'm not interested really in saying it's cheating right now. I want to ask, why is he doing that? What is the structure there? Why is he invested in that sort of thing? And to explain that, I want to very quickly set the philosophical backgrounds here. So at this moment for Heidegger, this is part one of the essay, we want to follow the path of the stranger as a blue path and as a question of blue, of bluing, of blue as the holy concealed in darkness, and something like originary holiness prior to, say, a division between light and dark. And related to the animal, we need to get from a simple animal to a blue animal. We need to get the animal totally shot through with blue, gentle, and trackle for Heidegger would teach those few who can listen how to effect this resurrection of humanity, how to get wandering, Geschlecht, gentleness, sort of sexual difference as tranquil, not discordant, and thus futurity, right? So I really apologize for this next slide. It's pretty it's pretty nuts. I tried to get everything, but this is this jump I'm trying to analyze with you, right? And the second poem of it is Night Song. So we jump from Rest in Silence to Night Song. And I have the trackle up there and then Heidegger down here. I'm not going to read all of it, but I want to try to understand the stiffness rock stuff here. So earlier we had the becoming, the forcing into the active place of the holy, right? Here we have something like a petrification, something like an animal becoming a rock. And I think there's a sort of Medusa thing going on in this whole text, right? And so what do I mean? How does that work? So, how does Heidegger get there, right? He's got to get into this second poem, Night Song, the looking motif. So Heidegger wants to say, you look into the holy blue, or the animal looks into the holy blue, then we get the rock, right? You look into the holy blue, you go silent, and then he says, silence is, so he says if you look here means enter into silence. So we get to look to silence, then to rock, right? That's the track we need to do. But there's not really any looking in the Night Song poem here. I mean, you could say there's a face, so there must be looking. That's maybe less immediate than Heidegger needs here, right? So he's fast-forwarded to later in the poem where there is a mirror of truth, there is that sort of thing, and kind of cheated it in there, right? And if you look at this word, Mittelgar, so he says, the right next line is the rock line. So, my did the power of silence in the rock. And the translation omits this immediately. And I don't think that's justifiable. And I think that this immediately is indicative of a general tendency or desire in the metonymy of Heidegger to get things close to each other. He uses this immediately a few other times when it's a question of the soul as a strange thing on the earth, all of that, right? And he says that sentence is immediately next to another sentence. It's not literally, but it's an immediate proximity. So I just want to mark for you, one of the values of the metonymy stuff is forcing stuff together, cutting and pasting the poem so you can force things together, right? And so in the end, this, I think, is related to a general tendency of the poem, of the trackle essay, to want to get closer to the Gedicht. So I'll talk more about that in the second part of the talk. But so I think that, so for Heidegger, there's certainly petrification or something like that going on in trackle, and he has a lot of textual justification of this, really, right? And I want to think that as a sort of dangerous or unmasterable thing, but I just want to note, for Heidegger, he doesn't think it's good. And we'll get to that with the talking rock stuff in the second part. But one possible takeaway of that, if I can convince you that there's something dangerous or nefarious or strange about this petrification, is that this probably is a risk in the trackle text that Heidegger, through metonymy, through what he's doing, has kind of revealed to us that we couldn't maybe access otherwise, right? So Heidegger is going to respond to any suspicion of this rock stuff being turning to stone as death or becoming like losing futurity as, well, you don't understand death in trackle, right? It's not death, it's undergoing. You don't understand rocks, the pain stuff, you don't get any of this, right? So I'm not going to address those responses head on, but I want to talk about, I want to take a short detour, and this is the part 2 of things, that involves what I would call Heidegger's heating up over the course of the trackle essay, right? He's on fire. I really think that Heideggerians talk about this essay as if Heidegger was like Michael Jordan and their NBA commentators, and they're so admirative, right? He's on fire, right? And that's part of why it's so impressive. And so how to demonstrate this heating up, right? It's very difficult to do, but a few indications that I'd like to give you. If you recall, the trackle essay is divided up into an introduction of about 3 pages and then 3 parts, right? And each of they're numbered with a Roman numeral, and in each of them, Heidegger at times describes the aim or the occupation of this part relative to others. So here is the division between the first and the second part. And I want to draw your attention to here, the site, so the situation, the big deal here, has only been pointed out after the first section. So that contained everything that I just cited for you, the metonymy of the 2 poems. So we've only pointed stuff out. So implied there is we're going to get to another relation to the Gedicht other than indication, right? We're going to have some sort of more proximal, more immediate relation, right? But as Heidegger gets closer and closer to the Gedicht, you get more and more fire stuff, more and more scary stuff, more and more like all-consuming flame. Things get more and more threatening. And to indicate this sort of acceleration, I have just this one quote I want to direct you to about the primeval earliness stuff. So if you look at the German, well, here in the translation you have older because it's more mindful because it's more still because it is itself a greater power to still. There's this raising of the stakes, right? More and more and more. And it ends with this becoming grammatically active, right? So it's not just silent or more silent, it's silencing. And I'm not going to make a meal of this, even though I think it's a big deal. But stillen means breastfeeding, so that's the most insistent meaning in modern German. And it's been that way for a while, since about like 800 AD is what the internet said. I'm not sure exactly about the etymology, but it's a very insistent meaning. So this stillender could mean more nurturing as breastfeeding, right? Not just more making silent. But anyway, the more originary is becoming more active, right, and more Medusa-ing, sort of, I would say. So, I had said petrification, and I hope it's clear I'm not talking about simple petrification. I'm talking about a sort of specific and apparatic style of petrification that's, I think, really interesting and idiomatic to this text, which is petrification as becoming active, as in turning into something that speaks. And that is what happens as things heat up. That's why we get to the rock talking and Heidegger being so excited that the rock itself is speaking. So that heating up also means we're going to get more flame discussion, whereas in the first part we had no flame discussion, right? So flame completely absent from the transformation he talked about in the first part when we're only indicating, right? So I am interested about the question of what is the Gedicht really? And what is this process in the essay, what does it tell us about the Gedicht? I think it's interesting that Derrida imposes the word idiom on it, and it's interesting how dangerous and serious things get. So these are more examples about becoming active. Sort of Heidegger's really excited about Trakel saying, using words in an active transitive mode that's rare in German, right? It's just more sort of evidence for that claim. But when things get really dramatic with the Grodeck stuff, and this is near the end of the poem, of course, that's when the sort of really unsettling question of what is the Gedicht really could sort of be answered as it's something like hell, or it's something like the death drive, or something. So you have this claim about which apparently David Krell finds unforgivable, which I just want to restate the drama of, that Heidegger is saying this poem, the Grodeck poem, is not a war poem. Why exactly? Because these sort of fallen people, they're of the old Geschlecht, the sort of not good Geschlecht. So the poet should be happy they're dead. Like, this sort of, like Jesus. So it's like Heidegger is saying, in the name of Trakel, if these folks died after the war, if it really were a war poem, the poet would be happy, because they're the old species, right? They're prior to the bluing, resurrection, becoming gentle stuff that Heidegger's talking all about, right? So that heating up becomes really dramatically dangerous, right? So my sort of final point, or my conclusion, would take this line as a sort of starting point of Heidegger's talking about who can wander like Trakel, or who can begin a journey with Trakel. And he says, without obvious textual justification, I think there are possible justifications, but it's not obvious from the immediate context, right? That they're few and unknown, so seldom, so low number, right? And I think what we can do is we can look at the sort of how Heidegger reads Trakel, and kind of say the opposite, or almost the opposite of what this says here, that the essential seems to happen all the time, right? It happens over and over in Trakel, and there's this sort of mutual fascination and repression of number throughout the essay. So at one point, Heidegger says there are more than 30 different rocks in Trakel's poems to justify talking so much about rocks, right? And then he says, but we can't even count here, right? We can't even really talk about number. There's no number here. He also says the ein of ein Geschlecht doesn't really mean one as opposed to two. It's not a numerical. So he wants to not be in the numerical, but kind of continually has to make reference to it. And metonymy, I think, this essay is a good example of, has a relation to number, a relation to something like the uncountable or swarming or multiplicity, right? Heidegger doesn't just cite a few poems of Trakel or even a few in a regular way. His text is swarming with citations of Trakel. So much so he forgets he talked about them. Like if you look at, he explains what Grodek is twice here. Says this first one comes first in his last poem, and then again, I forgot to put it along. Well, he'll introduce it again. He says the war poem stuff of Grodek is a war poem, etc. So you can't even keep track of all the stuff he's citing, right? And so the thought is, why does Heidegger do this? Why does this metonymy, what is the relation to the becoming gentle or becoming tranquil, something like this, right? And the thought is, maybe that becoming gentle is part of a defensive reaction, a way to quiet down, sort of this metonymic reading machine that Heidegger has unleashed in reading Trakel, right? So Trakel would be just the poet for this, I think, and it would be because his poems are like lists of images, right? They can't really be put in anything but metonymic relation to each other, and that's part of his signature. Now, I'm not saying that Trakel is pure metonymic chaos or anything like that, but the thought would be that if we want to try to explain why Heidegger read Trakel and why this happened to Trakel specifically, we might just say we have a metonymic poet who's got kind of one foot in metonymy, one foot in like montage of images, and the other foot in Christianity, and that Heidegger is responding to that and seeing that signature, right? And I think part of the reason Derrida kind of just has gotcha moments on Trakel, on the Heidegger Trakel stuff, is that Derrida doesn't want to have his own reading of Trakel. He feels like he doesn't know enough about Trakel, that sort of thing. And I think that if you don't do that somehow, I certainly don't have any expertise in Trakel, but I think if you don't try or try to find out how things are going, you can't have an affirmative reading of Heidegger's reading of Trakel, right? So I'm not saying Heidegger's defensive reaction or risk, this unleashing of this inflaming Medusa, metonymy stuff that I'm talking about is bad. I'm not criticizing it. It's probably co-implicated in some way with survivance, itself, with survival itself. Nietzsche says somewhere in the Genealogy of Morals, when he's talking about the Christian thought of justice and debt, which he was probably just as critical of, or about as critical of as Derrida was of Heidegger, that this justice, Christian justice, ressentiment, all that stuff, all that finishes, this is Nietzsche, like every excellent thing in this world by destroying itself. This auto-destruction of justice, we know what beautiful name it takes. It is called grace. And just because such a risk is irreducible, it doesn't mean it always happens in the same way, at the same order of magnitude, with the same number, with the same quantity, right? And so with and against Heidegger, with and against Trakel, I think we can, in reading them, learn how to navigate this risk, this probably irreducible tendency for finite beings to be dragged to hell, to the inferno, which is what Derrida calls reading Heidegger, right? Mm-hmm. So, that's it, yeah.
I'm just putting this on.
Oh, I don't want to make any decisions. Authorize yourselves.
Go. From a father to a father.
Okay.
Out of this, your talk, and then David's at the end, kind of made me think of Derrida as a father. Especially because 1984 was a very difficult year for him. Not just because he was he was fearing not being appointed to the post at the OSS, but because his son with Sylvia Agassinsky was born on June 18th. And you were talking about how Derrida theorizes paternity on the basis of recognition.
In for what tomorrow?
In for what tomorrow. And in fact, he had a lot of trouble recognizing Daniel as a son, and did so only 2-3 years later, apparently at the request of his wife, Marguerite. It's a very difficult subject, and I think it's also a Geschlecht question in the sense that it's easier for me, of a younger Geschlecht who never knew Derrida, to even raise this question. And then, of course, I'm thinking, so is the Geschlecht text, is the Geschlecht III text that was written months after Derrida's son was born, a son he kind of didn't really want to be born, even though he never apparently tried to stop it. But he certainly never did much to support it, including financially, if we are to believe what's said in the biography. So let's say that that text, that Geschlecht III text, is marked with this paternity, the inability or difficulty in recognizing paternity. Then, I don't know, we can, start fantasizing and become a bit of a psychoanalyst here and say to Katie's paper, no wonder why he can't spell Geschlecht.
That's nice.
Or even things like, picking up on what David was saying about Heidegger's inability to recognize how Jaco is in fact mourning those who were dead. This immediate generation, and Heidegger's need to say, no, we're skipping a generation here. And then questions about the unborn, those who died too soon. I mean, it's difficult, right, not to take this autobiographical scene as, I don't know, wishful thinking. If only those were, in fact, those had died too soon. It's not a question, I just think that it's something that it screams. And the last thing I wanted to say is, Derrida himself said to his biography, I can't remember to whom he said it, but he did say that 1984 was the strangest year of his life.
Yeah.
And maybe this is something to consider. What do you have to say?
Well, I mean, first, your comment is really interesting, obviously. My interest certainly did not lie in that. I mean, I think it did occur to me at some point as I was presenting it today that, yeah, I mean, one could certainly read that background into the paper that I'm giving as though I'm sort of recounting an allegory of a disavowal, which is not my interest here, right? My interest in going to Kafka in analyzing this As ein Kind is rather to take this motif of family and the problem of the idiom as it emerges in Geschlecht III, and the hope, I don't know that I actually succeed in doing it, but the hope was to then look and see how maybe it can serve to brings us towards an experience of undecidability towards a kind of other, right? And precisely within this structure of the family, whether it's formed on biological, juridical, like however lexical, right, grounds, and see that. I mean, I was trying to make some kind of connection to what I thought would be an irresolvable question, but the irresolvable question that imposes itself is like, maybe that's what Derrida's getting at, the future of the seminar that he's talking about in that first session, right? About precisely a position between absolute translatability and absolute untranslatability isn't resolved in a position, but rather in the imposition of this possibility we can't actually, right? So the avowal, disavowal, the relationship to the son that is and is not a son is a kind of vigilance. It requires a kind of vigilance rather than a decision. I guess that's what I would say, and that I have Derrida's personal history is something that, yes, I have considered, but like, I wasn't there, and it's not for, I have no interest in, making any claims about it one way or the other. Do you want to respond, David?
No. But it's a stimulating, I don't know, I don't know how to respond, but it's a stimulating question.
Yeah, I have a question about your use of the word, Adam. I was really struck by it.
Okay.
That you were saying the word Geschlecht, and that words are born into families and form families and die. This is, kind of an open question, but what is it about the Mark word, right, that makes it a better figure for being born than Mark or Trace or Odrivek or whatever?
Well, because we have dictionaries and lexicographers, and histories and first instances and hapax legomenon.
So
we have an entire architecture surrounding that requires that there be some kind of word that we trace, that we try and find origins for. It's not the word, I don't know that there are words ultimately, right? But we have a whole structure around this and the idea, right, is and that Derrida is doing. He's doing it in Geschlecht III, right? The imposition of the language of family around words and also around Geschlecht and questions of biology and race. That is something that we couldn't just be like, all right, we're done. Like, you can't just separate them because it's also not clear that it comes from the one to the other, right? It's not clear that it comes from words to the biological or comes from the biological to the lexical.
Right.
At least it's not clear to me.
I find it very interesting that you move towards Kafka, and that particular theme story, because if we consider that there is a certain kind of fabric into what would be all the family of Geschlecht, so the fabric of words, right? And then you have this kind of, we don't know what it is in Kafka's story, but what we know, it's a part of the 2 feet, is that it has it's kind of a thread,
Yeah.
And thread it comes from the Latin fil, and fil is what makes, from the fabric, the textile, we make the fil.
Yes.
The hilo, no?
Well, it's dangerous because filament and fils are not linked, at least not in French.
But it's the fabric of Geschlecht.
But
and then you can use the filament.
No. I agree, but it's like the fact that we can actually take that as it's hard to separate all the, at least in French, the threads from the sons. But the fact that we can't actually separate them, even though etymologically speaking one should, is a sign of the, we can't separate them even though we should be able to. And that says something about the way that the structure of families, lexical families or whatnot, is not so stable. But I agree with you. Zvern also, which comes from 2, you can do interesting things in German with that. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for Brian. I thought that it was very interesting that you brought up the figure of the border. At the end, you talk about the desert and about the complicated figure of border nationalism. So I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that, because I find it very interesting, not just in the context of the Trump wall, but also in the context of the fact that I think that Heidegger assumes that Track has placed himself as some kind of a hyper-border dweller, and Heidegger insists on the condition of hyper-border dwelling in that piece. So.
Right, yeah, I emphasize that liminality. So that liminal quality is really, place is liminal. Place is always open to more places, to further places. So, and Heidegger, I think, is great as far as that goes in emphasizing that fact. And I think that's part of the significance of all the dusk talk and whatnot. So that's great, but then as I say that, despite having done that, then Heidegger goes on and kind of blows that up and obliterates that, and it seems akin to me to building a wall right through a border. What has that promise of being a dusk or a dawn or whatever, that liminality ultimately is subverted. So it's topical, so that's fun, and just the fact that we have this demonstration in the name of the border, and I grew up there, and there is a sense of that as a place characterized by its like borderness, the borderland. So that just struck me as a nice parallel.
Yeah, I was trying to follow up, so. Sure.
You
go ahead.
go first.
Well, please. And then Michael after the two. So, go ahead.
Well, thank you, all three of you. I kind of have a question for all three of you, but it might be mostly for David. Could you say more about this Medusa? Is this like Freud's Medusa, the mythological Medusa, and this petrification? Because in a way that figure of petrification, and I kind of was going to say sort of facetiously, are rocks and stones the same thing? And they're kind of not, because we have, it's Stein, and the Stein has the ein in it too, and I guess what I wanted to say is, as you, I think, rightly pointed to, what excites Heidegger, and this kind of is liminally to Brian, what excites Heidegger is that the stone speaks, so that it's something in that action of petrification that is what becomes a voice of that which can speak more than speech in only pointing, in some sense. That I kind of didn't agree with you, Brian, when you were saying beyond speech. I don't think there's anything in Heidegger, I mean, that's not how I hear the silence. It's not beyond speech. It's petrified speech. And so I kind of wanted you to talk more about the Medusa and the sexuality of the Medusa.
Yeah, so I think that in terms of which Medusa is it, I don't know, I'm working more from just archetypical or just general, what seem to me general structures of it, and so why choose the figure of the Medusa? For a couple of reasons. One, this question of looking, so the freezing or the stoning usually happens through looking.
But in that passage that you have, the looking is what, it's very different from the Perseus Medusa thing, in the sense that it's the petrification that brings a revelation. And that it isn't, it brings into being, as it were, something, which is not what happens really in the Medusa story.
Yeah, so I think that Heidegger's interpretation of it and reading of it as that ends up sort of flipping things like this. So when you have petrification as bringing speech, bringing the word, what's the problem with that? Well, maybe the problem with it is if you have a Gedicht that has to remain unspoken, actually the question of bringing the word, of bringing the logos, is a petrification or death or killing, right?
But it's not killing, it's birthing. I mean, it's not a killing, that petrification. It's very alive.
So that's Heidegger's argument. I think that things like the Grodeck stuff, things like the sort of magnification of the flame getting bigger and bigger makes it...
What about that big flame, as you put it? What about your figure of it heating up?
So the thought is that that flame getting bigger and bigger has to belong or have some relation to the structure of the Gedicht, and that as Heidegger gets closer. He doesn't ever specify the alternative to indicating the Gedicht, right? But there's a clear movement of proximity, increasing proximity, and claims like we're going to look with bright eyes, with light eyes that are later, and he demarcates that relation to the Gedicht as different from the indication stuff at the beginning, right? And so my thought is that the reason why you don't have flame in the first part, and then flame seems to accelerate, ending with basically a celebration of the Second World War, death of it, through ventriloquizing Trackle. The reason that happens is this moving closer to the Gedicht, which maybe is an all-consuming flame, maybe is something like the death drive, or something that is much scarier than just the idiom of a great poet, maybe.
I guess I would want to say that Ian's poem speaks, I think that to what the flame and spirit is doing. Ian's poem. Ian's paper. Ian's poem, because it was a poem. I'm really tired. Ian, take it away.
Well, so a few things. We could think about the biblical provenance of the all-consuming fire. So God as being an all-consuming fire, but also possibly the spirit of love, right? And there's that sort of twofold possibility, which I think Heidegger's picking up on, although attempting to secularize or pre sort of Christianize. So I'm just kind of noting that in passing. Another thing I want to mention is speaking stones, Orpheus. That mythology, their speaking stones start to sing, everything starts to sing. You can look at Monteverdi's L'Orfeo for that. So I have lots of questions, actually. Sorry. So maybe let me start with Brian, just following up on what you said to Alberto. So I think I agree with your conclusion. I think Heidegger might reply, the people in the East, right, need to go to their place. Right? So this is saying they need to develop their own language. Don't import Western metaphysics into your Taoist traditional thoughts. But I think he would reply that even in the United States today, that we're so affected. Maybe even the Japanese are so affected by the language of Western metaphysics that we can't just simply sort of go to our place.
Right.
Or that it would require a kind of negotiation, and that we can't just simply sort of brutally change place. And so I'm just wondering what you would reply to that. That's sort of the historical weight of the Abendmahl.
But it seems to me that double movement that's originary and futural at the same time, it really does seem to me intrinsic to the kind of logic of colonialism. I mentioned that sort of odd nostalgia that does seem to underlie imperialist ideologies and does seem to underlie utopianism. So I am wondering if you can avoid this kind of expansiveness, this kind of expansion out of itself when you invoke the particular temporality he invokes with that double movement. So that's one thing. Another thing is, like Westerners, we have to go to our place. But like I said, I don't know, forests, these deer he's always seeing everywhere. This is not my place. And I'm, of German stock, as it happens.
Right, but I think Heidegger would agree. He would say, yes, don't take up my language of the forest path.
Right.
I think that he would say that that's kind of we're becoming Heidegger to some extent.
Could I just add one thing? Because one thing I was struck by at the end, very convinced by your criticism of Heidegger, as it were, sublating space into time in what's in the end a metaphysical way. But the gesture at the end to go back to where we're from, that's also a temporalizing, right? That's a temporalizing of space as well, as though you thought that there was some primal space into which we were born that then took a priority over some other kind of space. That seems deeply problematic to me, because that's also a temporal narrative structure, which seemed like the mirror image of what I took you to be criticizing Heidegger for. So he's got a futural utopia, but it seemed to me that you had a narrative of origins lurking somewhere in there that was actually undercutting the radicality of the argument about the placiness or spaciness of place and space.
I grant you it's tricky. But I would say this, and I think it actually speaks to what came up with Umberto's paper. I think maybe a distinction between historicity and temporality. So maybe there are other kinds of temporality. And, you know, I referenced Native American thought. There's a book called Wisdom Sits in Places, which speaks to how ethics is grounded. I want to say in the Hopi people, this may be wrong, however, but it's about their experience of ethics as grounded in place, where you certainly have a temporality. There's certainly the temporal dimension to their understanding of the world and whatnot, but it's fundamentally rooted in memory of place as opposed to, you know, history of being or a teleological kind of movement, or at any rate, whatever Heidegger does when he invokes this double movement. But it's, yeah, it's not easy. I would agree that that's, you know, would take some work to kind of tease out.
I sort of think that speaking stone you could
yeah,
go there.
I think so. I think that fits.
I think we have, let's say, 5 more minutes, so a couple more questions, and then we can all, like, we can all be gestalt or gestalt.
Yeah, exciting.
We need to be still.
Yeah.
I have more questions.
Stillender, always more.
I have more questions, but I want to let me see if other people.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Give it to you.
Yes. Go for it.
Put a point on it.
All right, David. So this last line you quote here, who are they that begin such journey? You interpret this as Trockel's poems. There are few and unknown.
No. I don't think Heidegger's literally saying that. I'm saying that it's interesting that even though there's just one Gedicht and there's very few, the number is on the side of low, right, of people that wander this. It's interesting that that's true, and also we have so many poems of Trakel to cite in so many different ways that we lose track of them. And we have this mutual fascination, this like fascination with and repulsion before number, right? There's like 30 different stones and rocks. Stone's not the same as rocks, I agree. So all these different stones in Trakel, but I can't talk about number, right? And there's 2 or 3 poems all titled with like this. So isn't that important? And like this, there's a constant recourse to it. And then the strategy of metonymy is also a strategy that seems like it has if it has any number, it's an incalculable number. You can always have more metonymies, etc. So all of that, I think, is Heidegger doing something that this maybe doesn't describe, or that contradicts this. That's the claim, yeah.
Well, so yes, I think that's really interesting, and I'm trying to think about the kind of Christian current that you mentioned also in Trockel. And he says at one point that each of his poems is a kind of redemption or atonement.
Yeah.
And it seems like there is a sort of, it's for the few, and that Heidegger is kind of picking up on that aspect of Trockel, where there is this kind of maybe gathering there.
Yeah, so,
And so I think it's interesting that you're bringing up both of these moments in Trockel.
Yeah, so I think that, like, when I said I thought maybe there is textual, so he doesn't cite it or explain it, but I think if you're reading Trockel and you're looking for this, and you can go to motifs of like loneliness, solitariness, and you can get something like that. I think there's another possibility there in Trockel and in Heidegger's reading of Trockel, right? Yeah.
Can I just ask one thing? After all of this metonymy, I was a little bit surprised at just the offhand comment where you make and say, where you assume that Heidegger just that quickly is like you're agreeing with Krell, basically, totally, that Heidegger is a disavowal of all of the dead in World War II.
Yeah.
You totally agree, so that's referential. That what Heidegger is doing is actual.
Well, but it's referential in denying the reference, right?
No,
So
World War I for Trockel, World War II for Heidegger. That was, the argument I heard David making is that Heidegger is denying Trockel's grief about World War I and plastering that on World War II. So the dead that are being denied are the dead of World War II, who also were burned and disappeared.
yeah, so I think that it seems hard to I think probably I would sign on to that wider argument. I think, though, you could just have the maybe more minimalist argument of Heidegger is saying, there's no way this can be about World War I because he'd be happy if it was, because the old Geschlecht is dying. That's good based on all this reading I've done. That's like, yeah, I do agree that that is like an obscene and just crazy thing to say, right?
It's tricky though, right? Because then we might very quickly get back to the Emmanuel Fay showing images of the, of the atrocities of the Holocaust and lumping Heidegger with.
So yeah, but I don't think I'm lumping though, right?
No, I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying that accusation to assign guilt to Heidegger for disavowing the bodies of the Holocaust. It's a very difficult move and very difficult to explain in the name of which that is.
Yeah.
So I don't understand the confusion with it, so I'll just explain the argument as I see it. So Heidegger says this can't be a war poem, it can't be a referential poem about World War I, right? Why? Because if it were, the poet would be happy, jubilating about it. So because the old generation is dying off, right? So it seems implicit in that, to me, not really, it seems just hard to avoid the conclusion that there is a celebration of a lot of deaths there. Guilt, all of these other questions. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it just seems like he's saying that to me. Yeah, it's hard for me to avoid that.
Well, that's what Krell thinks. Those are the lines that are absolutely unforgivable. And all of Heidegger.
I wouldn't say they're unforgivable, because I think when you say something's unforgivable, you sort of forgive it, right? So I don't know.
I'm just repeating Krell. Was very.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying that would be maybe one way I would be different with him about that. Yeah.
What if it's just rigorous? What if actually he's following in a kind of hardened way the law of his interpretation? It's possible to do that and still be monster. It could be real in the Heideggerian system.
Yeah. So I think
Is that too perverse?
A little bit.
I don't know. I did say I wanted to be positive, right? I don't know. Keep it positive.
Well, great hearing you.
Thank you, guys. Okay. Yeah.